Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Norma Bashar. I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters. I would like to introduce the chair of the Department of History, Professor Andy Weiss, who was instrumental in putting all of this together. Professor Weiss is a graduate of Columbia University and specializes in American urban history. His interests include the history of suburbanization, housing, landscape, and the role of space in the production of race and class. Students, if you're here, remember that and register for Professor Weiss's class. He's a very well-published scholar. Among his publications is the book Places of Their Own, African-American Suburbanization in the 20th Century. Came out with the University of Chicago Press. The University of Chicago Press is probably one of the top 2-3 presses for history right now. The book won the award for Best Book in North American Urban History from the Urban History Association and the John Cawelty Prize for Best Book in American Culture Study from the American Culture Association. He's also the editor with Becky Nicolaides of the Suburb Reader. Came out with Routledge Press, also a very well-known international press. And my understanding is that this is the second edition of a very well-received book. Professor Weiss has also served on the board of directors of the Urban History Association and the Society for American City and Regional Planning History. He's been chair of the department for 1 year. Doing a wonderful job, and once again, I wish to thank him for help us organize this wonderful evening. He's here with his son. Hello. Who's also been very, very helpful. So thank you very much to both of you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Norma, for that warm welcome. It's really a thrill to be here and to be in this crowd for this occasion. And I want to welcome everyone who has come here, and that includes my friends and colleagues, current and past. It's delightful to see and get a chance to chat with you again, who I haven't seen for a while, and those of you who I see all the time. I want to thank also the students who helped us organize getting down here from a reception. I want to thank everyone in Dean Bouchard's office for helping to coordinate this great event, especially Shanna Lorienzo and Bart Schaaf, who are over here. We owe this evening to the generosity of Dwight E. Stanford, and I wanted to say a few words about Dwight Stanford. He was a lawyer, he was a philanthropist, he was a fixture of civic life in San Diego throughout much of the late 20th century. He was a lifelong San Diegan, he was a lifelong friend to SDSU, and he was the benefactor and leader of more civic organizations than we have time to name, from the Boy Scouts to the United Way, and I'll stop there. Dwight Stanford endowed the professorship that bears his name in 1990 out of the belief that San Diegans needed to understand the relations between the United States and the rest of the world and the other nations and peoples that were in it. And for the last 27 years, the Stanford Chair has brought leading scholars of United States foreign relations to San Diego to live, to write, and to teach. When our last Stanford Chair departed for green pastures in Texas a couple of years ago, we began a nationwide, extensive search to find a replacement who would fill big shoes. And our choice, the winner in that process, is here with us today, and we really couldn't be more pleased. Since the early 2000s, Pierre Asselin has been really at the cutting edge of the field of United States foreign relations. His work from the early 2000s with his first book, which came out in 2002, I believe, really pressed the issue forward in foreign relations history that it was impossible to truly understand how nations related with one another unless you could do in-depth primary research on both sides or all sides of those relations. As Pierre would have you would put it, is you can't understand one hand clapping. We need to understand how nations are relating, and if we're going to do the history of these relations, we need to understand from the inside of both places what the motivations and understandings and assumptions and interests and expectations of each side were. And so for the last 20 years, Pierre Asselin has spent many summers, or most of those summers, in Vietnam, as well as in the United States and Canada, and more recently in Algeria, in the archives of the nations who were involved in the Vietnam War, not just the wartime nations that were involved in that conflict, but also to try to understand the ways that that conflict became a global conflict that changed our world, the whole world. And Pierre will talk more about that in a few minutes. Pierre Asselin is the author of 3 books, including Vietnam's American War, A History, which comes out next month with Cambridge University Press, and he's got a flyer and a poster back there, and you certainly can even order and purchase the book if you like what you hear today right up there. On a personal note, illustrating his transnational connections, Pierre is a native of Quebec and spent the last 26 years or so in Hawaii. And so he's one of those rare people on the earth who both plays hockey and is an aficionado of stand-up paddleboarding. Pierre's brought along with him on loan from Hawaii Pacific University his wife, Grace Chang, who's working in the political science department this year, and they've made their impact on San Diego State University and its students already, hosting last month a very, very provocative and well-attended and urgent conversation about historicizing the American presidency. How do we understand from a historical perspective, where are we today? Is this new? Is it not so new? And it was a very exciting conversation, and we look forward to more conversations like that and many more that are like this. My colleagues and I in the Department of History believe that there is no better time or place for San Diegans or any people to understand the history of American foreign relations. We sit on the edge of Latin America. We sit on the borders of the Pacific Rim and Asia. We live in a world which is shaped by transnational flows and connections. And we are also in a university which has more veterans and active duty military personnel as students than almost any in the country. Living here in the San Diego region are more veterans and military active duty personnel than almost any city in the United States. San Diego is a city which is a crucial hub in America's defense posture. This is a city where people understand the importance of history for the present and acting in the present. And we think that the people of San Diego are hungry for more. And so we hope to have Pierre as our ambassador to raise both the profile of the Stanford chair and to help us reach out for a companion position, an endowed chair in military history, who would help raise the profile of San Diego and San Diego State in this critical area. If you're interested in the programs of the Department of History, take a look in your program, and my colleague Pablo Ben back there is going to be passing around green sheets. If you want to stay connected, put your Facebook handle down or your email address down, and we'll stay connected with you. We won't overwhelm you, but we'd love to be in touch. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to the Dwight E. Stanford Chair of United States Foreign Relations History, Dr. Pierre Asselin. Thank you very
much. That's quite an introduction. Thank you very, very much, Andy, Dean Bashar. I can't begin to tell you how much of an honor it is for me to be at San Diego State. I was really crushed when I left Hawaii, to be honest with you, but it's become impossible to miss Hawaii now. I'm loving this school. I'm loving my colleagues, and I'm adoring my students. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really, really glad to be here, and I will not let you down. I promise. I can promise that much. Having said all this, the history of the Vietnam War was made by those who were directly involved in it. And given the occasion, I'd like to acknowledge the people in our audience who were in Vietnam during the war, whether American or Vietnamese. Would you guys mind standing, those of you who are veterans of the war? The Vietnam War is an absolutely fascinating conflict, and it's a very controversial conflict also, but it still matters a great deal. Having said that, I'd like those of you who feel that your lives were deeply, profoundly impacted by the Vietnam War to stand, just out of curiosity. How many of you feel that your lives were profoundly affected by Vietnam? Yeah, it's for the younger people, thank you very much for standing. For the younger people in our audience, I think it's very hard to imagine the extent to which this war changed the United States, changed Vietnam, and also changed the rest of the world. And that's what I want to address today. I want to speak to you about the Vietnam War as a global phenomenon, as a world war, if you will, of a different kind. You know, when you're named Pierre and you work on Vietnam, a lot of people assume that your grandfather died at Dien Bien Phu or was a colonial officer in Indochina. As you know, I'm French-Canadian. I have no connection whatsoever to Vietnam, to the French in Vietnam, to the American experience in Vietnam. This is why I got into the Vietnam War. I'm not kidding you. I was in high school. I watched Rambo 2. That's the one where he goes back to Vietnam to rescue his POW buddies. And the next day I had to write a paper about violence in the Western world in my history class. I really didn't like history. I shouldn't say that, but it's true. And so I went to my teacher. I said, well, I watched this movie about Rambo killing a bunch of Chinese, so I'd like to write a paper about the war the U.S. fought in China. Quebec City growing up, we were all white, all French-speaking, and all Catholic. It was incredibly homogeneous. I never really met Asians, so I assumed all Asians were Chinese. And to give you an idea of how far I've come, right? My teacher nicely told me, he goes, Pierre, I don't think the U.S. ever fought a war in China. I think you're talking about the Vietnam War. And I wrote a paper entitled The Vietnam War that dealt with booby traps based on a single book with a lot of pictures in it. But that was enough to kind of get me going in that direction. And eventually in college, I had a professor who was ethnic Vietnamese, and he kind of set me straight. I thought the war was cool. I thought the war was fun. And he really kind of gave me an idea of how painful the war was for the people involved in it, on the American side, but also on the Vietnamese side. And that was a very humbling lesson. And from there, I became interested in the other side in the Vietnam War, in what the Vietnamese themselves went through, and specifically in what their policymakers were thinking. Why do we keep talking about Vietnam? How did a small country the size of a postage stamp on a large map of the world become the object of the second longest war in American history? For the longest time, it was America's longest war. And it's been its deadliest war since the Second World War. How did that war come to mean so much to people in the United States? we talk about Korea, right? The Korean War, which is in so many ways similar to the Vietnam War. And yet that war is the war that we forgot. It's the forgotten war. Vietnam has been labeled the war that never ends. What accounts for this enduring obsession with the war in American political, military, and academic circles? Why can't we talk about American foreign policy since Vietnam, including talking about the recent American ventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, without conjuring Vietnam, without framing the discussion within a post-Vietnam context? Why, after more than 4 decades, does Vietnam still matter? As you may know, Vietnam was a colony of France starting in the mid-1800s. The French very systematically exploited Vietnamese labor and resources and culture as well. Eventually, the Vietnamese would fight for their independence. That struggle led to the liberation, as they call it, of half a country. Vietnam, starting in 1954, actually consists of 2 separate zones, 2 separate political entities, a northern half controlled by a communist regime and a southern half controlled by a repressive but pro-American government. The North will be propping itself up with support from the Soviet Union and China in particular. The South will receive ample assistance from the United States. Eventually, war breaks out. What is initially a civil war, really, to reunify the country under a single system. The war, taking place as it did in the Cold War context, is quickly internationalized, which is what prompts the American government to start deploying its own combat forces in that country. Unbeknownst to many people, though, Americans were not the only foreign forces fighting in Vietnam to contain communism. Forces from the Philippines, from Thailand, from South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand were also present to participate in that struggle against communism. American military intervention in the small Southeast Asian country began in full force in the spring of 1965. The ensuing Vietnam War, as we call it, or the American War, as the Vietnamese today call it, lasted exactly 8 years. The American military direct presence in Vietnam lasted 8 years until the spring of 1973. Its final outcome, however, was not decided until 2 years later in April 1975. The war, as I've just suggested, effectively pitted tiny North Vietnam and its ostensibly ragtag army of Viet Cong allies in the south against the United States, the government of South Vietnam, which at one point is the 5th largest army in the world, and other allies I've just mentioned in a David versus Goliath-esque contest. As each side widely publicized the merits of its cause and the wicked intentions of its enemies, with a view to winning hearts and minds at home and overseas, the war turned into a global media sensation, the most potent symbol of the political realities of the time and of the global Cold War in particular. As some of you might know, the Vietnam War was the world's first television war. It was regularly brought into people's living rooms during nightly news broadcasts. Audiences in the United States and around the world closely followed the war's progression, just as we would follow the progression of a riveting TV drama, of a soap opera, of a Ken Burns film. People took sides in the war. The war left no one indifferent, particularly in the United States. People were emboldened by it, and people mobilized for it. To be sure, the war produced more than its fair share of shocking and stupefying moments. immortalized in iconic footage and still images. And you have a sample here. I'm sure you've all seen these pictures. We don't always understand their context, but we've all seen them. And that's one of the legacies of Vietnam. The brutalities of the war, reported by hundreds of correspondents and photographers on site, eventually prompted governments and ordinary citizens everywhere to demand that it be ended. The war elicited protests and counter-protests of tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people on all major continents. The Vietnam War, and this is my main point, mattered as much to the rest of the world as it did to Americans and Vietnamese themselves. In that sense, the war in Vietnam was much more than a police action undertaken by the United States. It was also much more than an anti-imperialist struggle waged by the Vietnamese, or a limited war between two rivals. The Vietnam War was a global event. Consider the war's impact internationally. The Vietnam War was the most consequential conflict of the Cold War. It was a symbolic crucible for testing the staying power of the so-called free world, the capitalist world, against that of the progressive world, the socialist world. It's been the most far-reaching armed conflict since World War II, impacting the world in several profound and meaningful ways. The Vietnam War escalated Cold War tensions, which had been abating since the Cuban Missile Crisis of late 1962, and just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, raised the specter of a superpower hot war. The Vietnam War marked the ascent of the People's Republic of China as a major player in world politics, a role it has not relinquished since. China rose, not in the past few years, as those instant TV analysts would have us believed. It did so in the 60s, it did so in the 1970s, largely because of the war in Vietnam. You might be familiar with what's happening in the South China Sea these days. The Chinese claiming ownership of islands in the Spratlys and the Paracels. Unbeknownst to many people, China's push in the area did not begin 3 years ago. It started in 1974, before the Vietnam War came to an end, when China seized islands that were at the time controlled by the pro-American regime in Saigon. There's a very long history of Chinese engagement in the South China Sea. It's not a new problem, and it's a legacy of the Vietnam War. To say that China is an irresponsible state actor today is showing tremendous ignorance for history. Relative to the China of the 60s and 70s, China is extremely responsible. China was terrifying to policymakers in the United States and in the West in the 60s, owing to Mao's commitment to revolutionary struggle, not just in Vietnam, but across the Third World. Elsewhere in Asia, the Vietnam War prompted closer and, for the most part, enduring U.S. political, military, and economic ties with Thailand, with Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and Pakistan. The Vietnam War bore directly on the formation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in 1967, ASEAN, and the adoption by the international community of the One China policy that's effectively chipped away at Taiwan's sovereign status ever since. Consider the war's impact in the Third World. The impressive resistance put up by Hanoi and the National Front for the Liberation of Southern Vietnam, the so-called Viet Cong, hastened decolonization by rousing independence movements across the Afro-Asian world. It energized the non-aligned movement of would-be neutral governments against superpower entanglements and bloc politics, all the while fostering unity and collaboration among newly independent third world states at the UN and elsewhere. Che Guevara, the Argentine-born revolutionary who helped Fidel Castro seize power in Cuba before being sent to sub-Saharan Africa and returning to Latin America to foment popular upheavals, spoke of creating 2, 3, many Vietnams the world over. In demonstrating the possibilities of national liberation based on a militant Marxist-Leninist template, Vietnamese revolutionaries galvanized insurgent groups from Mozambique and Angola to Nicaragua and El Salvador. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, drew both lessons and strength from the experience of the Vietnamese. In fact, the PLO came to see itself as closely intertwined with the Vietnamese in a common struggle against Western imperialism. The PLO struggle initially against Israel was very much presented as a struggle against Western imperialism, Israel defining itself as a Western state. The Lebanese Civil War, instigated by the PLO, broke out the year America's enemies won the Vietnam War in 1975. Now, consider the war's impact in the communist world. Though the communist bloc rallied to Hanoi and to the Viet Cong, the war critically undermined the unity of that bloc, primarily by aggravating the ongoing Sino-Soviet dispute. The conflict between Moscow and Beijing culminated in a brief but nasty war between the Soviet Union and China along their common border in 1969. And beyond that, it precipitated Sino-American rapprochement and Soviet-American détente during the Nixon period. Not only did the Cold War between Beijing and Washington end at that point. When you really think about it, the Cold War in Asia, specifically that between Beijing and Washington, ends in 1972. So not only does that Cold War come to an end, but the concept of a communist brotherhood was completely shattered, as was the idea that Marxism-Leninism could help nations improve their lot through support from the rest of the socialist bloc. Thus, I would argue, Vietnam matters because it contributed to no insignificant degree to the eventual collapse of communism in Europe and to its complete reinvention in Asia. The Vietnam War, and specifically how that war played out in the socialist world, effectively discredited Marxism-Leninism as a revolutionary ideology. Vietnam still matters if we consider its impact in the rest of the Western world. The Vietnam War fueled a countercultural movement that electrified and radicalized young people, moving many to become political and social activists in an assortment of causes. A few of these individuals went on to form far-left militant organizations, such as the Red Army faction in West Germany, the so-called Baader-Meinhof group, and the Red Brigade in Italy, both of which were responsible for spectacular acts of domestic terrorism. Left-wing political activism prompted massive general strikes and brought down a government in France, even as it engendered lasting socio-political changes there and elsewhere. The war also infused new life in the peace movement that continues to impact our societies. In Canada, the war in Vietnam encouraged radical elements of the Quebec Liberation Front to press for that province's secession by violent struggle. The Viet Cong were huge influence for Quebec Liberation Front radicals. And the whole matter of Quebec sovereignty has yet to be put to rest. Now, you Americans know two things about Canada. There's still militants in Quebec, and we make much better beer than you do. I was doing so well, damn it. But it's true, it's true. Got a couple of... Finally, consider the extent of the war's impact in the United States. No Cold War episode captured the domestic imagination to the extent and for as long as that conflict did. The Vietnam War left very few thinking adults indifferent. In fact, it galvanized them. It occasioned an acute national identity crisis that tore up the very fabric of American society by exposing and exacerbating old cleavages and creating new divisions. Not since the Civil War had Americans been more divided. The Vietnam War incited mass demonstrations in the nation's capital. It incited violent riots across the country. It incited deadly protests on university campuses. It even incited acts of domestic terrorism. Vietnam remains the only major American war whose outcome was conditioned more by the domestic and international response to it than realities on the field of battle. And I want to address this during the Q&A. Whenever we refight the Vietnam War, whenever we try to understand how the war could have been won, we always focus on the military strategy. The U.S. lost 50,000 soldiers in Vietnam. American and Allied forces killed, by official North Vietnamese account, 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers. 1 million enemies killed for 58,000 Americans dead. Tragic as that is, it's still a good ratio. I would argue that the U.S. did not lose the military contest in Vietnam. It did much better there than it did elsewhere. But because of other circumstances, the war turned out the way it did. The American war in Vietnam bore directly on the decision to lower the voting age from 21 to 18, to end conscription, the so-called draft, and move to an all-volunteer military service. Why does Vietnam still matter? Because that latter development has had dramatic implications for members of the armed forces and for those who command them. How many of you know active duty military personnel who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan 4, 5, 6, 7 times? Absent the draft, this is what has to happen. The war exhorted Congress to reassert its role as a balancer of executive power, to curtail the so-called imperial presidency through the War Powers Act, limiting unilateral presidential authority to deploy U.S. forces overseas. The reluctance to raise taxes to pay for the war produced significant inflation that obliged the United States to abandon the gold standard and float the value of its dollar. And in the wake of all of this, an influx of refugees from Vietnam and the neighboring states of Laos and Cambodia, the 3 formerly constituent parts of French Indochina, redefined the demographic and cultural landscape of localities from St. Paul to San Jose. In an entirely different vein, the Vietnam era witnessed a new high tide of innovation in American art forms, particularly music as social and political commentary. The war and related developments at home inspired a generation of singers and songwriters to produce a body of politically charged, electrifying compositions. Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, Justin Bieber have nothing on Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Crosby, Stills. See, there's a reason why you should hold your applause. I'm not done. They hold nothing on Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And as we all know, the real talent was Neil Young, who's Canadian. Now you can applaud. As the American music scene at the time suggested, the Vietnam War also eroded popular faith in traditional sources of political and cultural authority in the United States, including the presidency. The Watergate affair that led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon was both symptom and consequence of the domestic political malaise caused by the war. Owing to Watergate and other war-related scandals, many Americans came to openly question the virtues of their own socio-political order. Don't trust anyone over 30 became a popular mantra among young demonstrators and activists. their and others' criticism of American policy and actions in Southeast Asia and of those responsible for them boosted the appeal and legitimacy of progressive action groups at the time challenging the status quo, including the civil rights, feminist, Chicano, Hispanic, and anti-poverty movement. By the time the Vietnam War ended, many Americans had lost faith in their political leaders and the system that kept them in power. That loss still resonates in national politics today. Just consider how little respect Americans on both sides of the political divide have shown for the presidency in the last few years. This completely happenstance. I was looking for images that disrespected Obama, and I found this one of Obama as Hitler. And then I was looking for Trump, and sure enough, different sites have used the same Hitler picture to make their point about how they feel about Obama on the one hand and Trump on the other. But you know, the idea that Bush was stupid, widely advertised, right? That Clinton was a pedophile. I mean, these are direct legacies of the war in Vietnam. The war had that kind of an impact on popular perceptions of the American presidency. Finally, defeat in Vietnam shattered the notion of American exceptionalism for many Americans. Whether America is exceptional or not, I'm not contesting that. What I'm saying is that for many Americans who believed that the country was, the war in Vietnam shattered that notion. It collapsed the nation's self-confidence for a generation and caused the United States to tread more cautiously in the international arena. And here we have an interesting contrast. As Che Guevara had hoped for many Vietnams, former President Nixon came to call for no more Vietnams. Obsessed with minimizing casualties, Nixon's successors became reluctant to involve U.S. ground forces in combat overseas. The hasty withdrawal from Somalia following the so-called Black Hawk Down incident in 1993, and the more recent and problematic interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan attest, at least in part, to this continued hesitancy. Vietnam syndrome still echoes very high in American political and military circles. No war since 1945 has had such a cathartic, transformative effect on American society. The Vietnam War provoked a reckoning, a reappraisal of core values and public policies that led to irreversible political, social, and economic change. Many of the ideals, including a redefined sense of individualism, now evinced among young Americans, among you, the students, are direct legacies of the Vietnam era. The war changed the United States in important ways, as much as it changed Vietnam, albeit in quite different ways, and the rest of the world as well. Vietnam still matters and will always matter because it left an indelible mark on our world. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. We've got time for a few questions. I've got a microphone here. If you would like to ask a question, I'll bring it by so you can be heard.
Hello, Professor. How much did economics play in the Vietnam War?
You mean as a rationale for U.S. intervention?
Yes.
I would argue very little. My interpretation of the history from the American side is that legitimate concerns about communism, specifically legitimate concerns about American credibility in the larger Cold War, prompted the decision to become militarily involved in Vietnam. Johnson never wanted the war in Vietnam, but he also understood that avoiding a commitment or sustaining the commitment in Vietnam could ultimately hurt the United States more in the long term than it would solve problem in the short term. So I've heard the arguments to the effect that economic notions and ideas motivated the United States or its policymakers specifically to commit to Vietnam. But I just don't see that reflected in the documentary record.
Doctor, I have a question that has to do with some of the current things happening in the U.S. I see our country being very, not necessarily pro-military, but very much backing our military, especially here in San Diego. Now, my question is, given that situation now, do you see that as a direct result to the shabby way the guys were treated in Oakland when they came home?
Absolutely, absolutely. I had so much more I wanted to say, and that this is actually the foundation for a future book, an ongoing book project. But absolutely, the way the United States and Americans generally are treating their soldiers today, to me, is entirely a consequence of Vietnam and an affirmation of guilt for the response to those who served in that particular conflict. The way we try to contain reporters who go to war zones, similarly, I see as a consequence of the Vietnam War. For example, if you recall, right, the invasion of Iraq, we had these embedded reporters, right? They had to stay with military units. That to me is very clearly a response to Vietnam, where reporters could effectively go anywhere they wanted, report on anything they saw, and which, in the eyes of American policymakers at least, in hindsight, was not a good thing.
What do you think the greatest consequence on modern national security strategy has been from Vietnam?
I kind of touch upon that. To me, it's this reluctance to commit, as the U.S. should, to particular theaters. I think Iraq is a very good example of that. You know, before the United States moved into Iraq, the United States, the American military leaders effectively stated that the commitment would have to be substantial. Shinzeki was talking about, I think, 300,000 soldiers, right? The country has tried to wage war in Iraq and Afghanistan on the cheap because of the Vietnam syndrome, and the outcome and the lack of results, to me, are consistent with this half effort. But I think it has a huge impact on how policymakers today choose to approach conflict. The fear of another Vietnam is haunting American decision makers.
Good evening, sir. My question, going back to the reporters, do you think there might have been a difference between the way the Vietnamese treated reporters versus the way insurgents did, considering some of our reporters in Iraq were captured and killed publicly?
So this is a very good point. So the reporters in the South were basically allowed to run free. They could go anywhere they wanted, as long as they could hitch a ride there. And if Americans weren't willing to bring them, then very often the South Vietnamese would, or the Australians or the New Zealanders. In the North, and this is the very big difference, in the North, the regime in Hanoi understood from the very beginning the importance of controlling information. So from even before the American war begins, the regime in the North is exercising absolute control over the production and dissemination of information. Hanoi will allow foreign reporters to come to the north, but those individuals will always be very carefully vetted. And the reason why they end up coming to the north is because Hanoi has established that they will report sympathetically about what they see in northern Vietnam. And sure enough, they did. Beyond that, Hanoi always made sure that the tour they got would convince them that their position on the war, which was anti-war to begin with, would be validated. That's one of the elements I address in the book. The very critical role that Hanoi ascribed to information, and the really remarkable, in hindsight, the remarkable effort Hanoi conducted in manipulating and controlling that information. I talked about the 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong who were killed by American and Allied forces in the South. Hanoi never reported on those casualties. And until the war ended, the people in the North had no idea whatsoever that their forces were losing soldiers to that degree. It was only after the war ended that Hanoi started telling families, oh, by the way, your son was killed in the South in 1966. And that's largely the reason why no one in Vietnam today wants to celebrate the victory over the United States, except for the government itself. It was too painful. So this is a really important element, right? We always say, oh, Hanoi won because it was their country, and they were fighting for, those guys fought because they had to. And they won because they were governed by a regime that was prepared to expend as much resources as needed to be expended to prevail. But the very ironic thing is that, and few Americans know about this, the Vietnamese have tremendous resentment for their leaders during the war. And that's not Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is out of the picture. It's another guy whose picture I had up on the board earlier. But yeah, it's the control of information effectively allows Hanoi to sustain that war for as long as it did with the losses that side suffers.
Thank you for being here. One quick question. Was the war in Vietnam justified considering 58,000 American soldiers, 1,000 North and South Viet, 1 million, and the direct connection to nearly double that in Cambodia?
It's a really great question. And I've been thinking about it for a long time because of a note I got from someone I consider a friend now. I hope they're here anyway. The United States did not meet its objective in Vietnam, right? The idea was to preserve a non-communist South, and that failed. So on that level, right, the war from the American perspective failed to meet its objectives. In hindsight, it's easy to say, well, that war should have never happened. But here's the thing. Based on everything I've seen from the American side, and I'm talking about the discussions that Johnson, McNamara, Rusk, and Kennedy before Johnson were having. And based on what's happening worldwide at the time, I don't see how an American president could have avoided the war in Vietnam and survived politically. I think we failed to recognize how tense the international situation is as of the mid-1960s. We failed to recognize the memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which absolutely terrified people and really validated calls to contain communism, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis ultimately led people to conclude if we had contained communism in Cuba, we would have never had this crisis in the first place. So in '65, faced with a collapsing Allied regime in Saigon, I just don't see Johnson or any other American president doing otherwise. Again, it's so easy to say, right? Why not walk away? But given circumstances at the time, and given what was at stake, and that's what we fail to understand. The Vietnam War for the US, just as was the case for the Soviets and the Chinese, it was never about Vietnam. This is about the Cold War. This is about preserving America and its allies in what is construed at the time as this existential struggle against an evil force. And so kind of to renege on, first of all, a commitment to an ally in Saigon, and then to cower before communist aggression would have been so politically damaging to the US that fighting the Cold War after that would have been a lot more difficult. Above all, it would have validated Chinese assertions that the Americans were paper tigers and emboldened radicals in the Third World. I mean, Vietnam still did that in spite of the American intervention. Yeah, context is everything. It's really important, especially for you as students trying to make sense of these things, to kind of try and put yourself in the shoes of the guys who were calling the shots at the time. And I got to tell you, like, as much as it would have been nice to avoid the loss of life on all sides, I just find it very difficult for Johnson to kind of sidestep Vietnam and for him and his party to survive politically.
Hi, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
It's been really great. Hey, so I have a question in regards to strategic objectives. So I'm a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. I spent a long time in the military myself, and I guess what I'm wondering is, can you talk a little bit about the parallels between the strategic objectives in Vietnam as they were communicated to the military people on the ground and kind of the lack of those same? There's a lot of parallels made in regards to strategic objectives in Afghanistan and Iraq today.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those parallels?
Sure. So despite what people say, the objective was very, very clear in Vietnam. What Johnson and his team wanted was to preserve South Vietnam as a non-communist entity. And by the way, just so this was never about democracy, right? Often American policymakers would sell their efforts overseas that way, right? But realistically, during the Cold War, who are America's closest allies? They're right-wing military dictatorships. They provide security, and they support American-style capitalism. And that kind of touches upon what you were saying, although Vietnam is not directly involved in all of this. So there's this commitment to preserve the South as a non-communist entity. Of course, as the situation goes from bad to worse, the objective changes. I think the way we remember Vietnam is misguided. The idea that this time in Iraq, we're going to do it right by having clearly defined objectives, we had that in Vietnam. But like everything else, things don't always go as planned. And it's at that point that the objective changed in Vietnam. The disconnect was between the objective and the tactics used on the ground to meet those objectives. Again, militarily, the United States was incredibly successful in Vietnam. If the idea was attrition, killing as many of the other guys as American capabilities allowed, it did great. I mean, seriously, imagine this, right? So this is, by Hanoi's own admission, 1 million combatants. That's just combatants killed, to 58,000. You would have told any American leader in 65 that this is going to be the ratio. Basically, a 20-to-1 ratio? Would you be comfortable with that? Everybody would have said absolutely. But I think where the U.S. goes wrong is in fighting the war politically at home and diplomatically internationally. And that's where the U.S. gets beaten. Hanoi does a spectacular job of selling its war effort at home, in the United States, and internationally. And this all contributes to the reshaping of American objectives eventually, where we go from preserving the South to preserving American honor in Vietnam. With respect to going back to Iraq and Afghanistan, I think that where I see a major failure in terms of not learning from Vietnam is in appreciating who the enemy was in Vietnam and what could have been learned from that enemy and then applied to the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts. It's really stunning to me the extent to which American policymakers had no idea who they were fighting during the Vietnam War. We always talk about Ho Chi Minh, right? Well, Ho Chi Minh is out of the picture. Of course, they tried to keep that secret, but at a minimum, we all knew in 69 Ho Chi Minh dies. Ho Chi Minh is dead in 69, the war ends in 75. Who's in charge for those 6 years? We never asked that question, right? Something as basic as that. Imagine trying to make sense of World War II, trying to fight Nazi Germany without having a clue who Adolf Hitler is. But that's how the war in Vietnam was fought. American forces went after the soldiers, they went after the symptoms, if you will, but they never really went after their leaders, the core of the problem, in part because they had no idea who they were. And if you've been watching the Burns documentary, he sheds light on that. I've been spending the last 20 years of my life proving or trying to show that Ho Chi Minh is gone, is this other guy, Lays One, calling the shots. And I think that if Vietnam was unwinnable for the United States, he's the reason why. Lays One was really central to allowing this to turn into a victory for his side because of the kind of guy he was. Just highly dogmatic. I compare him to Stalin in the book. And he got what he wanted.
Good evening. I have a question that touches on your last comments about President's initiative and want to introduce the concept of President Kennedy. I understood that he announced that for the military advisors that were there in '63, he was going to pull them out at the end of October of '63. And we know he got assassinated less than a month later. And then Johnson turned up the heat on the war. What do you think Kennedy would have done if he wasn't assassinated?
So, very good question. So the Kennedy tapes, everything is out. So we now know with absolute certainty that on the one hand, Kennedy did say, I'm going to pull out 1,000 advisors in the fall. He did say that. But this is later in the tape. He says, I'm going to do it if the situation improves. The situation kept deteriorating. Kennedy was never going to pull the advisors out. And I'm categorical. The evidence, there's nothing in the documentary record suggesting otherwise. He did, again, say that he would be pulling out a 1,000-men contingent. But if the situation improved, and in 63, 64, it just keeps going from bad to worse in the South. So in a way, I think it's perfectly fair to look at Johnson as the logical continuation of Kennedy being in office, and as America's Vietnam policy effectively undergoing no drastic alteration between Kennedy and Johnson. And Johnson retains all of Kennedy's closest advisors.
Thank you, Professor. The question I would ask builds on that. If Robert Kennedy had been elected president in 1968, do you see that he realistically would have ended the war, and how might that have changed some of the dynamics that you described in both domestically and internationally?
Okay, so we often hear about this, right, that well, the U.S. did not make enough of an effort to negotiate an end to the war. That if the U.S. had tried harder, the war could have ended in 68 or 69 instead of 73. Whatever the U.S. was prepared to do, Hanoi was never going to agree to a negotiated end to the war before 1973. Hanoi wanted to defeat the United States militarily. The only agreement it would have accepted was one that would have been entirely in its terms, that would have effectively compelled the US to surrender South Vietnam and accept all of Hanoi's conditions for a settlement. So if Kennedy had been elected to office and tried to solve the Vietnam problem, he would have faced the same constraints that Johnson faced and that Nixon faced during the early stages of his presidency. The options would have been the same: either completely pull out and suffer the attendant humiliation, national, personal party, or try to preserve American honor in Vietnam, which, by the way, becomes Nixon's strategy, but it turns out had been the French strategy in Vietnam in '54 and then in Algeria in 1962. Lots of people don't know this, that Nixon's strategy for ending the war was actually modeled after de Gaulle's strategy for getting out of Algeria. It took de Gaulle 4 years to get out of Algeria. It took Nixon 4 years to get out of Vietnam. It's not coincidence. Nixon and Kissinger were following the French example because they thought, under the circumstances, the French had managed to salvage a modicum of their respect in Algeria, although that's always debatable.
Thank you, Professor, for an incredible lecture. I teach history at San Diego City College, and I would like to, the title of your lecture is Why Vietnam Still Matters. And I would just like to maybe add and hear your comments on a couple of the reasons why I think Vietnam also matters. One lesson from Vietnam is that wars premised on lies, not only don't they work, but they're absolutely immoral. Not only Vietnam, but also Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin, the whole fabricated incident that took place in the Gulf there, as well as what happened, the premise for war in Iraq in 2003. They're both premised on lies. And you make some interesting points about, and I agree with you, that the government at that time, you put yourself in their shoes, and nobody wanted to be soft on communism. No one wanted to admit, we now know, especially after the Pentagon Papers were released, that American leaders, starting with Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, they all knew that this was just a waste. It was just pouring lives and treasure down a black hole, but we have to save face. So don't admit we made a mistake. We'll just hope things magically turn around, and we know that they didn't. Then the second point I think is interesting, the second lesson from the Vietnam War that I think is, and I get your opinion if you think it was applicable, negotiations are not, are not an evil thing. I mean, at some point, the United States said we have to negotiate our way out of this mess. And then here today in the 21st century, the strategy seems to be don't negotiate, kill them all. We're going to kill all the terrorists. We're going to kill all of ISIS. We're going to kill our way out of any foreign policy problems that we have. Is that realistic? I mean, do you think that at some point we'll have to negotiate some kind of peace in the Middle East?
Those are both really, really good points. So this idea of wars predicated on lies, right? Vietnam is a good example, Iraq as well. Spanish-American War, 1898. Seriously, the Maine, right? Did the Spanish blow it up? Accident, right? World War I, Lusitania, passenger ship. Was it a passenger ship? It was carrying weapons, right? The War of 1812, right? Because of the British orders in Canada. I'm not kidding you, right? The Brits have basically removed the cause for the war. The U.S. still goes to war. So we like to trace that parallel between Vietnam and Iraq in terms of lies and fabrications, but there's kind of a pattern here. We've had several wars in American history, for the most part declared wars, that have been predicated on misinformation, let's say. So it's certainly a valid point. But in terms of the lies and sustaining the lies, this is where the issue of credibility comes in. The Johnson, McNamara know in 67 the war is not going particularly well. They're getting mixed reports, but they understand it's a challenging situation. But again, you know, what do you do? So the U.S. goes on this charm offensive in late 67, right, where Smoreland comes to Washington and talks about, he never said the light at the end of the tunnel. He talks about the end being within sight. So expectations are raised that everything is going well. And then what happens a month later? A Tet Offensive, right? Which it turns out was a huge success for the United States. Militarily, Tet was an astounding triumph for the U.S. But because of the way it was interpreted in Vietnam, in the U.S. and elsewhere, it becomes the turning point in the Vietnam War. But again, I think when you try to make sense of why they keep lying, it's certainly disingenuous. But to me, it's all tied to this issue of credibility and this concern over credibility. Problem is, eventually, the lies are very clearly exposed, right? Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers, now we have a record of them lying. They knew at this time it wasn't going well, and yet the following week, they actually publicly said this and that. So it dealt a grievous blow to the office of the president, which kind of ties to what I was talking about in terms of really kind of tarnishing the image of American presidents. Negotiations. This is a really good point. Anytime the country seeks to negotiate a solution to a problem, the assumption is that Washington is trying to appease its enemies. And sometimes appeasement or negotiations represent the only best way to solve a predicament. It's really tragic that we think so negatively about negotiations. You know, you could negotiate your way out of Vietnam because you knew who you needed to talk to, the guys in Hanoi. Iraq, Afghanistan, the opposition is fractured, right? You can make peace with one group, but then alienate another that was willing to work with you, and next thing you know, you're kind of right back where you started. But in terms of North Korea, to me personally, the idea that this can't be resolved diplomatically, it's the only way to resolve North Korea. You can't solve North Korea militarily. It's just not an option. Bannon is spot on when he says that. Unless you're willing to sacrifice your allies, South Korea and Japan, you cannot solve North Korea militarily. And that's the thing, is that during the Cold War, America honored its commitment, for better or worse, to its allies. And it's got a good history of at least trying to do that. And so consistent with that spirit, it does have to pay attention to South Korea and Japan when it acts in North Korea. And to me, that takes the military option off the table and only allows for a negotiated settlement.
We've got time for a couple more questions. I see 1, 2, 3.
Thanks for sticking around, by the way.
Professor, will the United States have a military presence in Vietnam today?
So this is a good question. So Obama was in Vietnam in 2016. I was actually in Hanoi at the time. And then Obama lifted the embargo on weapons sales to Vietnam. So the U.S. now is selling weapons to Vietnam. The Vietnamese construed that as a promise of U.S. support in the event of a war with China over the South China Sea. As far as the Vietnamese are concerned, they want to work closely with the United States, and they've actually hosted American, mostly warships, to this point. And given the situation with China, Vietnam would be more than open to the possibility of a sustained U.S. military presence in the country for the time being because circumstances warrant it.
When do you think it might happen?
It depends on the situation in the South China Sea with respect to China. It could be next week, it could be never. But China is conditioning Vietnam's relationship to the United States. Vietnam, the leadership in Hanoi is really good at balancing and manipulating big powers. It's very, very good at that. During the Vietnam War, it balanced between the Soviets and the Chinese, got maximal assistance from them. When it ended, they got close to the Soviets. Soviet Union collapsed, they got close to the Chinese. They got too close to the Chinese. What did they do? They normalized with the Americans. It's a small state, but it's got capable leaders.
Hi, good evening. In the Persian Gulf War in 90 and 91, General Colin Powell instituted a strategy based off of overwhelming force, became known as the Powell Doctrine. I don't know if the political situation would have warranted that back in 65, but do you believe that type of strategy would have worked militarily in North Vietnam?
It would have been, the idea of escalation, right? We find that very problematic. The thing is, in 65, China is extremely unpredictable. We don't know what the Chinese will do if the US moves aggressively against Vietnam. And Johnson was right. So many people don't know this, but during the Vietnam War, at one point, there's 200 Chinese soldiers in northern Vietnam. There's 200,000 Chinese troops in northern Vietnam. And they're there for a couple of reasons. They're providing logistical support and training to the Vietnamese themselves, and they're there in the event the US decides to invade North Vietnam. From the record in China and in Vietnam, there's every reason to believe that if the US crosses the 17th parallel, if the US decides to invade North Vietnam as it did North Korea in 1950, the same outcome ensues, Chinese military intervention. So if by overwhelming force you mean bombing and invading, then you have another Korean War on your hands. And that would have been probably more problematic for the United States than what it ended up dealing with in Indochina. As far as bombing, it's hard to imagine the US doing a better job taking out what it could in Vietnam. Again, the US is at odds with the regime in Hanoi. You start bombing dikes, you start drowning people, internationally that looks really, really bad. Dropping the bomb, inconceivable. There's no justification for that. Vietnam is not a total war like World War II was a total war. So overwhelming force has to be defined as, I think, militarily intervening directly against the North. But that, from everything we see on the Chinese and Vietnamese side, would have prompted, at 90%, a direct Chinese intervention in the Vietnam conflict.
Hello? Okay. Thank you, Professor, for tonight's lecture. I think you made a very interesting point about how it's easy to say that, we could have tried to avoid Vietnam, but that it would have come with great political costs. But my question, as I understand, Vietnam went through sort of reforms in the 80s. And so I'm just kind of wondering if those reforms would have been inevitable, or were they a result of sort of the legacy of Vietnam and us being involved militarily?
So that's a really great question. The reforms in Vietnam begin as communism is collapsing in Eastern Europe, right? So there's a commitment to reform in 86, but the reforms themselves don't take place until 89, 90, 91. So 89, communism starts collapsing in Eastern Europe. 91, Soviet Union collapses. And then Vietnam really starts to change. So it's a really good question you're asking. I think reforms may have been inevitable, but there's no question that they end up being precipitated because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the late 80s, Moscow is Hanoi's only real friend in the world. The Vietnamese are international pariahs because of their occupation of Cambodia. They went in to end the Khmer Rouge reign of terror, but then they never left. And that brought worldwide condemnation. So the only country that's really supporting the Vietnamese financially is the Soviet Union. Once they collapse in 91, reforms get into high gear. I don't think it's coincidence. But I think they would have been perfectly fine remaining where they were, because we're talking about a leadership that's always been incredibly conservative, so much more so than the Chinese leadership. We see that even today. There's a real fear of the outside. There's a real, as much as they want to invite the Americans, it would only be to serve this larger purpose of containing China. Just working in the archives, I got to tell you, it's absolute hell for younger people. I see it. I mean, it's the way they treat young scholars from Vietnam and elsewhere, because they're so protective. They're afraid some nasty secret will leak. I'm older. I got white hair. It's a little easier. But that's the thing. It's like no one cares anymore about the Vietnam War. I shouldn't say that, given that I just got that job. But you know what I mean, right? I mean, but somehow, you know, they're really afraid of some secret being leaked. But that's how the government remains. It's an incredibly conservative regime, and it's always been. And it's only reformed when it absolutely had to, unlike China and other leftist regimes. This will be the last question.
Oh boy, thanks for coming out tonight. I'd just like to ask if you might be able to address what I consider to be various, both Republican and Democrat administrations' propensity to support extremely corrupt regimes. You can talk about the recent ones of Iraq or Afghanistan and go back to Vietnam, South Vietnam's very corrupt regime, and go further back to Iran and back and back and back as far as you want. Could you tell us what you think is maybe some sort of a linear reason why that continues to happen and continues to draw failure for us in the end?
It's a very good question. We see, so during the Cold War era, for example, right, the U.S. is starving for allies, right? This is a contest for allies between Moscow and Washington. And so, for better or worse, we need to work with the governments who are willing to work with us, right? So what was it that Roosevelt said about was it the Guatemalan leader? You know, they might be sons of bitches, but they're our sons of bitches, right? So you create that history of committing to these regimes. And then again, going back to credibility, then your prestige, your credibility becomes pegged to those regimes, right? You get judged based on your loyalty to your friends. And it makes the United States look bad on occasion, but the alternative, again, to kind of sever ties with those regimes is rarely palatable. And I got to tell you, this is what I find most revolutionary about the foreign policy of Donald Trump. For all that people are saying, it's the U.S. since 1945, again, for better or worse, has honored its commitment to its allies, deplorable as some of these allies were, even when American policy makers knew how deplorable they were. And Trump has suggested an intent to revisit all of these relationships. That, to me, it's very, very interesting. It's really, really interesting. But yeah, they're not always good regimes, but they're regimes that were loyal to the U.S. during the Cold War. They're regimes that chose us over them. And I see, assuming history is important as I do, a desire on the part of American policymakers, even after the end of the Cold War, to continue honoring these commitments to people that we help put in power and, depending on the times, prove to be decent friends of the United States. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for coming.
It's nights like tonight that remind me why I came to work in a university 25 years ago. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This has been a fantastic conversation. We hope it continues. Stay in touch. Thank you.
Hey, students, thank you for coming, by the way. I really appreciate it. Thanks.